Hey friends, I thought I'd have a little bit of fun today. I want to talk to you about a couple of terms, some things that you may have heard about. THACO, however you want to say it, and minions. These are two terms that came about and existed in older editions of D&D. Now, if you're brand new to D&D, if you've first journeyed into this wonderful, fantastical world of tabletop role-playing through Dungeons & Dragons, and specifically 5th edition D&D, you may have heard of these terms, but you don't know what they are. So I'm only going to talk through two of them today, and perhaps if there's some good traction here, I'll discuss some other obscure terms from older editions of D&D. But I'm not saying that these are wonderful things or these are things that you should include into your game. I just want to put a little spotlight on a couple of terms that new players may have heard of, but you don't know what they are or where they came from. Now, for the veterans, for the older players, especially when we talk about THACO, that's 20 plus years ago, if not older. For you folk, and for those of you that also know what minions are, there may be a little bit here when I bring up these two terms and briefly talk through them, where you might say, oh man, I remember when we used THACO and it was awesome, and minions were incredible. But you also might say, I remember THACO and it sucked. I remember minions and it sucked. I think minions are really good. THACO, not a fan. But anyway, let's talk about what these two terms are. We're going to begin with the older one, which is THACO, okay? There's going to be a few different pop-ups and things where I'll and zoom over and move over to the right side of the screen and put some stuff on the left side of the screen or whatever to help illustrate this point a little better. Now, I'm going to use my cheat sheet very, very quickly here. THACO, however you want to word it. First off, to understand what this is, we need to realize that this thing is an abbreviation for 2-hit armor class 0. That's what THACO or THACO stands for. That O at the end is not an O, it's a 0. 2-hit armor class 0. In older editions of D&D, basically before we hit 3rd edition D&D, the lower your armor class, the better your armor class. You were more defensive, you were harder to hit as you had a lower number, all the way going into negatives. So that's the first thing that must be understood. THACO first came about, I believe, in 2nd edition D&D, where it actually was sort of labeled as such. There was kind of this weird wonky chart, I think, in the 1st edition D&D Dungeon Master's Guide that had like it was a chart, and it kind of showed this is what you roll to hit the various armor classes along the left side, all the way from -10 to +10. But in 2nd edition D&D, they brought about this term called THACO, which again, to hit armor class 0. Okay, so the best armor class you could have was a -10. -9 was an absurdly good armor class. You were very difficult to hit, but obviously not as good as -10. -8, -7, you get it. 0 was kind of the baseline. Now, even though 0 is kind of in the middle, because it ranged from -10 all the way to +10, even though 0 is in the middle from how I remember it, understand folks, we're going back 30 plus years here, a 0 was still a pretty damn good armor class, okay? So, THACO represents the number that you need to roll on your D20 to hit an armor class of 0. It gets a bit mathy, and I'll kind of throw up some numbers here on screen to help you navigate through this. I'm not saying, as I said in the beginning, that you need to use this. I'm just talking you through what it is. So that way, if you're a new player to D&D and you kind of want to be able to fit at the table with those that are talking old geezery, old school D&D, you feel like you fit in a little bit. You know what THACO is and what it stands for and why it was used, okay? So just remember and understand that the lower your armor class into negatives, the better your armor class was, the harder you were to hit. So let's say we have a fighter with a THACO of 14, okay? Wherever that number comes from doesn't matter. That means the fighter, in order to hit a creature with an armor class of 0, that's what THACO stands for, 2-hit armor class 0, you need a 14 or better on your d20. Now, when you rolled your d20, you did still add a bunch of bonuses or perhaps some negatives depending on circumstances, right? But generally, if you rolled a d20 and I rolled a 14 or higher on that d20, I'm going to hit any monster with an armor class of 0 or worse. Which, understand, if they have an armor class of 1 or an armor class of 2 or an armor class of 3, I'm still hitting you. Because remember, the higher the number of your armor class in old D&D, the worse your armor class was. Okay? For example, let's pull this guy up on screen. Here's a Pit Fiend. I believe this artwork, though, is from 5th edition D&D. All right? We know the Pit Fiend as some creature of incredible power, right? A monster of just death and destruction that is difficult to hit, dishes out tremendous amounts of damage. Here's the stat block for the 2nd edition Pit Fiend. I believe this was in the 2nd edition Monster Manual. Notice on screen, its armor class is -5. If you were to see the Pit Fiend in 5th edition stat block format, you would expect that its armor class, your ability to hit it, is more difficult than fighting a goblin, let's say, right? No different than plate mail has a much higher number than studded leather, right? Notice here, this Pit Fiend in 2nd edition has an armor class of -5. Remember, the lower the number into the negatives, with the best armor class in the game going down to -10, the harder it is for you to hit that monster. So if we refer to our fighter with a THACO of 14, that means to hit armor class 0, you need to roll a 14 or better. Okay? If we were to attack this Pit Fiend, what we're going to do is do some math and start subtracting. So to hit an armor class of 0, I need to roll a 14 or better. To hit an armor class of -1, I need to roll a 15 or better. To hit an armor class of -2, I need a 16. You get it. Our fighter needs to roll a 19 or better in order to hit this Pit Fiend. The math just sucked. It's just what they had. I don't know why they did it. And I think ever since 3rd edition, whether we're looking at video game numbers or accounts, literally finances, right, in your bank account, we now have this notion, which is more intuitive, the bigger the number, the better, right? Which is why an AC 18 plate mail armor is better than an AC of 12. Just any 7-year-old looking at 5th edition D&D, they want bigger numbers. That means you're harder to hit. So ever since 3rd edition, now the higher your number on your AC, the better you are. The harder you are to hit, the more defensive you are. Therefore, THACO no longer applies anymore because that was kind of going backwards. That's all to say, that's where THACO came from. That's what it is. I just wanted to talk to you about what it is, and in my opinion, 3rd edition, 4th, 5th edition has just made it much more elegant, much smoother. You don't have these weird numbers to go with. Though, I remember back in my THACO days, we would just have these charts where you can just read across, right? And whether we made the charts or I don't remember if it was actually printed in the various DMG or the 2nd edition player's handbook, there was just a chart. So the DM could say, hey, the Pit Fiend has a -5. You just look across the chart. Okay, THACO 14, I need a 19 or better. A THACO 11, I need whatever. Okay, so that's what it was. I'm just talking to you about what it is. Next, let's take a look at minions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this up on screen real quick. One of the cool things, minions came about in 4th edition D&D, okay? One of the I think the cooler things about 4th edition monsters is it was all of 4th edition, but especially combat, was very video gamey, okay? It had these sort of roles and encounter powers and daily powers, basically abilities that the characters could use once per combat, once per day, whenever they wanted to, so on and so forth. Monsters, as written in the Monster Manual, also had numerous roles. You had monsters that played the role of skirmisher, that played the role of controller, kind of ranged attack guy, damage dealer, a leader, a solo type dude, an elite, whatever it may be. One of the roles of monsters in 4th edition D&D was something called the minion. I think there is an elegance and there's a sweetness to these monsters. And again, the point of the video is not to sell you on one of these two, it's just to tell you what they are, so in case you didn't know what they were. I think there's an elegance to 4th edition monsters because they kind of help inform even the modern 5th edition DM how you might want to use various monsters so that everything doesn't just devolve down into roll to hit, you hit, roll to hit, he misses, so on and so forth. Just, you know, damage sponges and meat shields where kill them until they kill you, right? There's a little more elegance in the various rolls because they help inform the dungeon master as to tactically how you might want to play this monster. I believe Matt Colville made a really good video on this, which you should check out. Just go ahead and Google it, YouTube it, whatever. And he talks about the concept, I think, if I remember the video correctly, of using minions or the concept of the various roles and how you can apply that to 5th edition monsters. But all of that is beside the point. The monsters in 4th edition D&D, there were some that had this role called the minion. And this minion role applied to, you know, don't think of minions as just throwaway monsters that applied only to the low-level monsters. Here's a stat block of, I think it's an angel, if I remember what stat block I'm putting up on screen. Notice the 2 stat blocks that have the red arrows under them. We are looking at minion rolls, minion variants of this very, very powerful monster. The key concept and the core concept of minions, highlighted in the red boxes here, is minions are very, very low level, or I'm sorry, they're creatures that essentially have 1 hit point. And the idea behind them is they can still cause tremendous amounts of damage. They can still be a point of concern and a point of focus for your players to have to deal with, because they're still filling the roles as brutes and soldiers and artillery and skirmishers. But the very concept of a minion is they only have 1 hit point, which is to say, if you just put any attention towards them, whether it's in a fireball, an AE effect, or a single hit, as long as you deal damage to them, we don't have to track hit points. They basically have 1 hit point. You kill the minion. So pay attention to them, eliminate them, which it's easily done. But the interesting thing with minions and the way they worked in 4th edition is sometimes they can kind of become the forgotten little combatants on the field. And if we read through the things that are in this red box here, you see how minions can play a really good role of giving the dungeon master the chance to include more threats, more danger into the battlefield without bogging down the pace of combat. So I think minions was a very elegant thing, and I use these now. I don't, you know, obviously use the exact same stat blocks because it doesn't translate. But in 5th edition, oftentimes, I will have large numbers of monsters thrown out onto the battlefield that my players need to pay attention to. It's kind of a glass cannon concept. They will cause havoc on the battlefield. They will control certain things. They will be the ones responsible for casting certain spells that create difficult terrain, or maybe grapple, like grasping vines or whatever it's called. You know, things that sort of immobilize or restrict the damage dealers of the party or the tanks of the party. All you have to do is just devote your round, your action, to saying, I want to hit this guy. As long as you hit, it's dead. We don't need to track hit points. So that helps alleviate the burden of me tracking 61 different monsters and all their individual hit points. Just, okay, you're attacking him, roll the hit. All right, you hit, he's dead. Right? But you still have to pay attention to it. So it was a really cool, not just minions. As I said, I believe the roles of 4th edition monsters was something that we should all take a look at. So that's kind of the essence of it all, the essence of this video. I just wanted to highlight and talk to you and spotlight about THACO, what it was, and minions. THACO, we never need to use that again. I don't care what your nostalgia is. It was too wonky, counterintuitive. I'm glad D&D has moved away from that. The system of what you need to roll to hit and the armor class system is much more elegant now. Minions, though, I think that's something worth looking at. As is many of the things from an often shit-on edition of D&D, which is 4th edition. Perhaps I'll be making another video on why I think 4th edition is a hell of a lot better than people give it credit for. I think that's all I have for today. Thanks, everybody. See you guys later.